Karen hurls wine bottles at staff over Corkage fee. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The upscale restaurant in the heart of wine country was nothing short of an experience. The warm golden lights from above bathed the room in an intimate glow, casting long shadows across the finely dressed diners and well-appointed tables, while the delicate hum of classical music played softly from hidden speakers, filling the air with a sense of sophistication and calm. The evening was in full swing, and the dinner rush had created a buzz in the restaurant that was both lively and refined, as waitstaff moved in sync, navigating through the room with practiced ease, balancing trays laden with perfectly plated dishes and decanters of carefully selected wines. The patrons, many of them regulars who came to the restaurant for the unmatched quality of both food and atmosphere, spoke in low tones, savoring every moment of the experience. Outside, the vineyard stretched for miles under the fading sun, the perfect setting for the refined and rustic elegance of the restaurant's decor. The staff was in a groove, moving like clockwork, order after order coming in, each prepared to perfection, each dish served with an impeccable level of care and attention to detail. Everything in the restaurant was running smoothly, from the coordinated dance of the servers to the carefully curated wine list, which boasted the finest selections from local wineries. It was clear that the restaurant had built its reputation on consistently offering the best of both worlds, gourmet food and world-class wines. Guests trusted the restaurant for their special occasions, anniversaries, and celebrations, knowing that each visit would be an unforgettable experience. In the center of it all, behind the polished bar, the sommelier stood, a picture of quiet authority, his eyes scanning the room for guests who might need his expertise to make a wine selection. He was a man who knew his craft, a sommelier who could pair wines with meals in a way that felt almost magical, enhancing every bite, deepening every flavor. But then, she walked into Karen, her presence immediately apparent to everyone around her. Her entrance was bold, her heels clicking on the marble floor like the ticking of a metronome, deliberate and unwavering. She was dressed in the finest designer outfit, the kind of attire that looked expensive and screamed wealth with every piece. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was flawless, giving off the unmistakable air of someone who knew she was at the top of the social food chain. She carried herself with an air of superiority, scanning the room as if she owned it, her eyes lingering on the patrons seated at the tables with just the slightest hint of condescension. She was exactly the kind of customer the staff had seen before, a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted, when she wanted it, and with the kind of entitlement that demanded nothing less than perfection. Karen's table was already prepared, of course. She had made a reservation in advance, and the restaurant knew exactly what to expect. Her preferences were on file. She was a regular here, someone who visited often enough to be recognized by the waitstaff, though she certainly never remembered any of their names. Tonight, she had arrived with her companion, a man who looked somewhat out of place next to her, a little more reserved, a little less certain of the grandeur of the situation. But Karen, oblivious to anything but her own sense of importance, moved through the restaurant as if she were the queen, taking her seat with a flourish that seemed to demand the attention of everyone around her. After settling in, she immediately took to examining the wine list, as if it were her personal duty to critique the selections, though it was clear that she had no real interest in the wines themselves, only in asserting her dominance over the process. The sommelier, noticing her attention on the list, walked over to the table, his calm demeanor unchanged as he greeted her with the polite courtesy expected of someone in his position. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm happy to see you again. Is there a particular wine you would like to try tonight, or may I recommend a pairing for your meal?" Karen's eyes flickered toward him, but she didn't immediately respond. She was still studying the list, her finger running down the names of the wines in a slow, deliberate fashion, as if weighing each one for its worth. Finally, she looked up at him, a hint of disdain in her gaze. "I'll be bringing my own wine tonight," she said with a nonchalant tone, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. "I hope that won't be a problem." Her voice was thick with an almost condescending confidence, as if she were doing the sommelier a favor by giving him the chance to handle such a sophisticated request. The sommelier, ever the professional, maintained his composure, his face unreadable as he nodded. "Of course, ma'am. While we do allow guests to bring their own wine, there is a corkage fee of $30 per bottle. His tone remained polite, but there was a firmness in his voice that indicated he was used to dealing with this kind of request. If you'd like, I can assist with uncorking your bottles when you're ready. For a brief moment, there was silence at the table. The sommelier stood there, waiting for Karen's response, his expression calm yet alert, aware that her next words could change the dynamic of the evening entirely. And change it they did. Karen's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a tight, controlled smile, and for a moment, the sommelier thought he might be imagining the shift in the air, but then it became clear, Karen was offended, deeply offended. Her perfect composure cracked just slightly, revealing the simmering rage underneath, and it was as though the entire restaurant held its breath in anticipation of her next words. $30? Karen repeated, her voice now taking on an incredulous edge. Are you serious? You're charging me a corkage fee to bring my own wine? In a place like this? This is unbelievable. Her words were sharp, her tone cutting as she spoke louder, making sure that everyone nearby could hear her indignation. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she stared up at the sommelier. You're telling me that I'm expected to pay an additional fee just to drink what I brought? That's outrageous. Do you know who I am? The sommelier, accustomed to dealing with difficult customers, kept his composure, maintaining eye contact as he answered in the same steady, professional voice. I understand your frustration, ma'am. However, the corkage fee is a standard policy for our establishment. It allows us to maintain the quality of service and ensures that all guests have an equally fair experience with our wine offerings. But Karen wasn't having any of it. Fair, she spat, her voice growing louder with each passing second. This is my wine. I brought it because I prefer it. And now you're charging me just to open a bottle? This is a total scam. You're robbing me, and I won't stand for it. Her voice had risen to a full-blown tantrum now, her face turning a deep shade of red as she waved her hand in the air, dismissing the sommelier's explanation. She was no longer speaking to him directly, her words had become more of a general rant, directed at anyone within earshot. The surrounding diners, who had been quietly enjoying their meals, turned their attention to her, their expressions varying from discomfort to curiosity. The air in the restaurant had shifted, and the hum of conversation had quieted as Karen's voice became the center of attention. The sommelier stepped back slightly, his professionalism unwavering despite the growing tension. He tried to explain once more, but Karen wasn't interested in listening. I'll just go ahead and open the bottles myself, then, she declared, clearly undeterred by the policy. And I'll make sure to let everyone know about this little scam of yours. Her words were venomous, laced with a kind of entitled arrogance that made the situation feel even more out of place in the otherwise calm, upscale setting. At this point, the manager, who had been monitoring the situation from across the room, began to approach, sensing that things were about to spiral further out of control. As she walked toward the table, she could hear Karen's continued ranting and the escalating tension. She braced herself for what she knew would be a difficult conversation, hoping that she could defuse the situation before it reached a breaking point. But as she stepped closer, Karen's eyes locked onto her, and the storm was about to break. The tension in the room was palpable, the once calm and elegant atmosphere of the upscale restaurant now thick with discomfort as Karen's outburst reverberated across the dining room. Every eye in the place was on her, some with pity, others with curiosity, and a few with open disbelief. It was as though the entire restaurant had become a spectator to a drama that no one had signed up for, and the longer Karen continued her tirade, the more uncomfortable it became. The sommelier, trying his best to remain composed despite the storm of anger that was raging in front of him, stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. He had dealt with difficult customers before, but this was different. This was escalating into something beyond a simple misunderstanding over a corkage fee. There was a palpable sense of entitlement in Karen's voice, a belief that she could bend the rules to suit her will, and it was clear that no amount of politeness or reasoning would cut through her fury. Karen's eyes were fixed on the sommelier, her face flushed with rage as she waved her hand dismissively at the wine list in front of her, as though the very idea of paying for a corkage fee was an insult to her very existence. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice shrill and loud enough to carry across the entire room. "I bring my own wine into your establishment, which, by the way, is overpriced for what you're serving, and now you want me to pay extra for the privilege of drinking my own bottle. Who do you think you are? This is how you treat your customers?" She scoffed loudly, and the sound of her disdain was so clear that even the other diners couldn't ignore it. The sommelier, visibly taken aback by her escalation, tried again, his voice soft but firm. "Ma'am, as I mentioned earlier, we do have a corkage fee policy that is standard in most fine dining establishments, and it ensures that we can maintain the high level of service and quality that our guests expect." His words were carefully chosen, as he knew that any attempt to challenge Karen directly would only add fuel to the fire. He was trying to de-escalate, trying to get her to understand that this wasn't personal, that it was simply a policy that the restaurant had to uphold. But it seemed that logic had no place in this conversation anymore. Karen's face twisted into a sneer, her lips curling with an expression that could only be described as pure contempt. "A policy?" she scoffed, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "I don't care about your policy. I care about being treated like a human being. I'm a paying customer, and I'm not going to sit here and let you charge me for the simple act of opening a bottle of wine. This is ridiculous, and you should be ashamed of yourselves." Her words were venomous, each one dripping with a kind of self-righteous anger that made her sound as though she were accusing the entire restaurant of some grave personal offense. By now, the noise from the kitchen had died down, and the soft clinking of silverware had stopped, replaced by the uneasy murmur of patrons who were clearly caught in the middle of something that was no longer just a misunderstanding. The waitstaff, who had been hustling to deliver food and drinks, had slowed their movements, their eyes darting toward the scene unfolding at Karen's table. The manager, sensing that this was about to spiral out of control, stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the floor as she made her way toward Karen's table. The manager was no stranger to difficult situations. She had worked in the restaurant industry long enough to know that some guests could be difficult, even combative, but Karen's behavior was different. This wasn't just a case of a disgruntled customer, it was someone who seemed determined to cause a scene, to create conflict where none existed, and to demand that the world bend to her will. "Ma'am," the manager began, her voice calm but with an edge of authority that couldn't be ignored. "I understand that you're upset, but this is our policy, and I'm asking you to please remain calm. We want to make sure that every guest enjoys their experience here, but this kind of behavior is not acceptable." The manager's tone was controlled, but her patience was clearly wearing thin. She was trying to bring the situation back from the brink of disaster, trying to avoid making the evening any worse for the other diners, but Karen wasn't interested in hearing her out. Karen's eyes narrowed as the manager spoke, and for a brief moment, it almost seemed as though the words had no impact on her at all. Instead, she continued to glare at the staff as if they were the ones who had offended her. "You want me to calm down? Is that it? You think you can just tell me to calm down after you've treated me like this?" she retorted, her voice rising again. "You're the ones who need to calm down. You're the ones who need to learn how to treat people with respect. I'm not some random tourist who's here to be your servant. I'm a customer, and I demand respect." Her voice was almost shaking now, the anger bubbling just below the surface as she stood up from her chair, the intensity of her words drawing even more attention from the surrounding tables. The restaurant, once a sanctuary of quiet sophistication, had become a battleground between a customer and the staff, and there seemed to be no way to stop the conflict. The manager glanced at the sommelier, who stood a few feet away, looking helpless but still maintaining his professional demeanor. "I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to leave if this behavior continues, ma'am," the manager said firmly, though there was a clear sense of frustration in her voice now. She had tried to be patient, to be understanding, but Karen wasn't interested in that. She wasn't interested in a resolution. She was interested in winning, in proving that she was right and everyone else was wrong, no matter the cost. Karen's response was immediate and explosive, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "You want me to leave? Fine," she spat, grabbing the bottle of wine from the table and holding it up as if it were a weapon. "But you'll be hearing from my lawyer. I'll have this place shut down. I'll tell everyone I know what kind of scam you're running here, and you'll never recover from this." The venom in her words was thick, and she was now shaking with a combination of rage and what appeared to be a deep sense of self-entitlement. The idea that anyone could challenge her, especially for something so trivial as a corkage fee, had pushed her over the edge. In her mind, the restaurant had become the enemy, and she was the hero of her own story, fighting back against the injustice she believed had been done to her. At this point, the manager stepped forward, signaling to one of the waitstaff to discreetly call security, her patience running out. "We are not going to tolerate threats or harassment," the manager said firmly, her voice now colder than it had been. "I'm asking you to leave the premises, now. If you do not leave voluntarily, I will be forced to call the authorities." Her words, though calm, carried an undeniable weight, and for the first time, Karen faltered. For a brief moment, it seemed like Karen was going to continue with her tirade, but instead, she seemed to pause, her face flushing even deeper as she surveyed the room, realizing that the situation was quickly slipping beyond her control. The other diners were watching her closely now, their conversations silenced by her outburst. She stood there, her body rigid, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. For a moment, it looked as though she might storm out of the restaurant herself, but instead, she stayed in place, her eyes locked onto the manager's face. The tension between them was thick, charged with the kind of unresolved conflict that only seemed to build with each passing second. Then, with a final, defiant glare, Karen huffed, "I'll be back for this. You'll regret this." She turned sharply on her heel and stormed out of the restaurant, leaving behind an air of stunned silence that hung in the room long after she had gone. The manager let out a slow breath, her body relaxing just slightly as she turned to the sommelier. "I'll handle the cleanup. Can you please check on the other tables and make sure everything's all right?" She didn't wait for a response as she stepped toward the mess that Karen had left behind. It wasn't just the broken wine bottles, it was the impact of her words, the way her outburst had shattered the peaceful atmosphere of the restaurant, and the unease that lingered in the air long after she had left. The sommelier nodded and moved toward the other tables, his expression solemn as he did his best to restore the atmosphere, but it was clear that the damage had already been done. The incident was over, but its repercussions would be felt throughout the night. The din of the restaurant gradually returned to normal, though the reverberations of Karen's explosive departure continued to echo in the air. The manager stood in the middle of the restaurant, staring at the broken wine bottles that littered the floor, their shattered glass glittering under the soft lights like jagged pieces of a broken dream. She exhaled sharply, the weight of the night's events pressing down on her shoulders. She had been in the industry for years, long enough to have dealt with difficult customers and to have weathered countless storms, but nothing quite like this. The sheer intensity of Karen's outburst, the brazen entitlement, the way she had turned an ordinary evening into a spectacle, had left a lingering sense of unease hanging in the air. For the rest of the night, no one in the restaurant would quite be able to shake off the memory of her furious tirade. The manager glanced at the sommelier, who was now moving around the room with a quiet efficiency, checking on the tables and making small talk with guests in an attempt to restore the atmosphere. He had been rattled, too, she could tell. He had handled the situation well, staying calm despite the barrage of Karen's insults, but it was clear that this wasn't the kind of experience anyone in the restaurant wanted to have. The sommelier caught her eye for a moment, his expression tense, as if he were still processing everything that had happened. She gave him a subtle nod, signaling that she would take care of the cleanup herself, and he moved on to the next table, trying to distract himself with the normal rhythm of the night. The quiet buzz of conversation slowly started to return, but it was strained, with diners glancing around uneasily, some avoiding eye contact altogether. It was as though Karen's eruption had stripped away the illusion of civility, leaving everyone acutely aware of how easily the peaceful veneer of the restaurant could be shattered. Some of the guests were still whispering about the incident, with murmurs rippling through the room as the story of the woman who had thrown wine bottles began to take on a life of its own. The hashtag Karen Throws Wine would be trending in less than an hour, and before long, the video of the outburst would be making the rounds on social media, feeding into the endless cycle of viral content that would fuel the flames of her entitlement. For now, though, the restaurant had to find a way to move on, to pretend that nothing out of the ordinary had happened and that the night would continue as planned. The manager, her mind racing with the various tasks ahead of her, turned her attention back to the broken glass. The cleanup wasn't just physical, it was emotional, too. She had spent years building up this place, cultivating an environment that was meant to be the pinnacle of elegance and tranquility. The food, the wine, the service, everything had to be perfect. But tonight, it had all been marred by a single customer's outburst, and the worst part was, there was nothing she could have done to prevent it. Karen had been beyond reasoning. The policy was clear, the corkage fee standard in every upscale establishment, and yet Karen had reacted as though it was a personal attack on her very existence. The manager shook her head, trying to shake off the nagging feeling that somehow, she could have handled things differently. The feeling of being blindsided by Karen's behavior lingered in her chest, and it wasn't going to be easy to shake it off. As she bent down to pick up the pieces of glass, her thoughts drifted to the other customers who had witnessed the scene. There had been a moment, just after Karen had stormed out, when the room had gone utterly still. The guests had been silent, some uncertain about what to do, others clearly uncomfortable with the scene they had just witnessed. The incident was unlike anything she had ever experienced in her years managing the restaurant. The entitlement, the sense of superiority that had radiated off Karen as she berated the staff, had been almost palpable. It was a stark reminder that, no matter how high the standards, no matter how carefully the restaurant worked to create a perfect dining experience, there would always be someone who saw themselves as above the rules, above the common courtesy that everyone else was expected to follow. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to see the barista, who had been working in the back, approaching her with a concerned look on his face. He was young, fresh-faced, with a genuine passion for coffee that showed in the way he crafted each cup with care. He had been there when Karen had started her tirade, and she could tell that he, too, was affected by what had happened. The barista stopped a few feet away from her, his hands stuffed into his apron pockets as he hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his voice betraying a hint of worry. The manager sighed and stood up, brushing the remnants of glass off her hands. She gave him a small, tight smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll be fine. It's just one of those things, you know?" She shook her head, as though trying to dismiss the weight of the situation. "I'm just glad she's gone. I didn't want it to escalate any further." The barista nodded slowly, his gaze flicking toward the door where Karen had exited, the memory of her screaming still fresh in the air. "Yeah. That was a lot. I've never seen anything like that here before." "I don't think anyone has," the manager replied with a chuckle that lacked humor. "It's just one of those things that happens. I guess we just have to clean up and move on." She paused for a moment, looking at the broken bottles that still lay scattered across the floor. The mess was almost symbolic, a stark contrast to the otherwise pristine nature of the restaurant. It felt as though the evening had been irrevocably changed, as though the night would never be the same after that explosion of anger. The barista, sensing her frustration, gave a small nod and stepped back, his gaze lingering on the manager for a moment before he turned to go back to his duties. The manager stood there for a moment, collecting her thoughts, before she turned to face the mess once more. She didn't want to spend too much time thinking about Karen, or the disruption she had caused. She needed to focus on the guests who were still there, the ones who had chosen to stay despite the scene. She had to restore the calm, had to remind herself that she was in control of the space. She wasn't going to let Karen's outburst define the evening, but she knew that it wasn't going to be easy. The customers, for better or worse, would be talking about what happened, and it would likely follow the restaurant for some time. Just as she was about to start cleaning up the final shards of glass, her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, checking the screen. There was already a message notification, a link to a social media post. She opened it, her stomach sinking as she saw a video of Karen's outburst. It was already being shared, the video spreading like wildfire across platforms. The title of the post read, "Karen throws wine bottles at upscale restaurant staff over corkage fee." The comments were flooding in, the internet already taking sides, debating whether Karen's behavior was justified, whether the restaurant's policy was too harsh, and mocking the entire spectacle. It was happening faster than she had anticipated. The situation had already spiraled beyond the confines of the restaurant. The manager's heart sank as she read through the comments, some sympathetic to Karen, others quick to condemn her behavior. The restaurant's name was already being dragged through the mud, with memes and snarky comments flying in every direction. She knew that this would likely blow over in time, but the damage had already been done. The reputation they had worked so hard to build, the brand they had carefully curated, was suddenly caught in the crossfire of a viral incident that no one could control. The manager sighed deeply and set the phone down, returning her attention to the cleanup. As much as she wanted to ignore it, as much as she wanted to pretend that everything was still perfect, the truth was that the ripple effects of Karen's tantrum would be felt long after the last wine bottle had been uncorked. The damage, in some ways, was only just beginning. The evening dragged on, and the atmosphere in the restaurant felt strained and unnatural. While the dinner rush continued, the earlier chaos seemed to have cast a shadow over the room, its lingering effects visible in the stiff movements of the waitstaff and the awkward glances exchanged by the guests. The manager, having dealt with more than enough of the cleanup, both physical and emotional, had taken a deep breath and steeled herself for the remainder of the night. The wine bottles, once elegant symbols of indulgence, now lay in ruins, scattered across the floor, a reminder of the unprovoked eruption that had thrown everything into disarray. In the wake of Karen's outburst, the restaurant had lost its usual flow, the serene and sophisticated ambience of the establishment now stained by the remnants of her tantrum. She was gone, but the effects of her behavior were still felt by everyone who had witnessed it, a collective unease that could not be easily shaken off. The sommelier, who had tried so hard to defuse the situation, returned to the bar, his movements less fluid than before, his expression weary. He wasn't upset with himself, he had done what he could, but it was clear that the incident had drained something from him, a bit of the energy and passion that usually came with his work. As he poured wine for the remaining guests, his mind kept returning to the moment Karen had thrown the bottles, the way they had exploded against the walls, shattering with a force that had seemed almost symbolic. It was as though she had intended to break not just the wine, but the very fabric of the restaurant, to disrupt the calm, orderly world they had carefully crafted. It had been a violent, irrational outburst, and in the aftermath, the sommelier couldn't help but wonder what, if anything, could have been done differently. He had offered an explanation, a simple, polite reminder about the corkage fee, but it had all been for nothing. Karen had been determined to make a scene, and nothing would have been enough to stop her. In the kitchen, the chefs continued to prepare dishes, their focus unwavering despite the chaos that had unfolded in the dining room. They were professionals, used to working under pressure, used to the stress of the dinner rush, but even they couldn't ignore the tension that had descended upon the space. The head chef glanced at the kitchen door, where the commotion had spilled in moments earlier, and sighed deeply. He had seen it all, difficult customers, complaints, requests that bordered on the ridiculous, but this had been different. This had been a clear example of someone who believed that the world existed to serve them, someone who felt entitled to bend the rules to their will without considering the consequences. The chef had walked into the dining room briefly during the incident, but had been quickly ushered back by the manager. It wasn't his place to intervene. But the way Karen had treated the staff, the way she had berated them in front of other diners, made him sick to his stomach. He returned to his station, shaking his head, not sure how much longer he could take the kind of entitlement that seemed to be creeping into the world around him. It was exhausting. As the night wore on, the manager moved from table to table, making small talk with the remaining guests, trying her best to restore the atmosphere, to remind them that the evening could still be salvaged. Her efforts, though well-intentioned, fell flat. She could see it in their faces, the unease, the discomfort. They had witnessed the spectacle, and no amount of polite conversation or fine dining could undo what had happened. It was a reminder that no matter how careful the planning, no matter how perfect the execution, one angry, entitled person could rip through the entire fabric of an evening. She knew that tomorrow's reservations would be just as plentiful, that the restaurant's reputation would remain strong despite the incident, but it didn't feel like it right then. Right now, it felt like everything had been cracked, like the smooth surface of the restaurant had been shattered, and there was no simple way to piece it back together. The sommelier, feeling the weight of the evening's events, glanced at the manager as she passed by, her face tight with the effort of maintaining professionalism. He saw the tension in her posture, the strain in her eyes, and he knew that she, too, was struggling with the aftermath. He hadn't heard the full details of Karen's departure, but from the looks of it, the situation had gotten out of hand in a way that no one had expected. "Are we all right?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with concern. The manager looked at him and forced a small smile, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes but at least tried to offer some semblance of normalcy. "We're fine," she said, though the words felt hollow. "It's just one of those things. We'll get through it." The sommelier nodded, but there was no real comfort in her words. They both knew that the damage had already been done. It wasn't just the wine bottles that had shattered, it was the illusion of civility, the idea that everyone in the room was there to enjoy the same experience, to indulge in the luxury and sophistication that the restaurant promised. Karen had stripped that away in an instant, exposing the raw underbelly of a world where entitlement and arrogance could overshadow everything else. It was a harsh reminder of how fragile the balance was, how quickly things could tip from elegance to chaos. As the night drew to a close, the restaurant began to empty, the last few guests finishing their meals in a subdued silence. The staff cleaned the tables, reset the silverware, and made their rounds, preparing for the end of the shift. The manager lingered near the door for a moment, watching the final guests leave, a small sense of relief settling over her as the door closed behind them. She turned to face the staff, offering them a tired smile. "Thank you for your hard work tonight," she said, her voice softer now, the weight of the evening finally lifting from her shoulders. "I know it wasn't easy, but you all did great." The staff nodded, exchanging small smiles, their exhaustion evident. They had weathered the storm together, and though the night had been far from ordinary, they had made it through. But as the manager glanced out the window at the darkened street outside, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Karen's outburst was just the beginning, that the entitlement and frustration of people like her were seeping into every corner of their world. It wasn't just a corkage fee that had set Karen off. It was something deeper, something that had been festering for a long time. The manager turned back to the restaurant, already thinking about the next day's service, but she couldn't quite shake the feeling that the world was changing in ways they couldn't control, and that nights like tonight were only going to become more common. The sommelier, as if sensing her thoughts, joined her at the door. "Tomorrow's another day," he said with a weary smile, his tone trying to sound more optimistic than he actually felt. The manager nodded, though the smile she gave him was strained. "Tomorrow's another day," she repeated, though in her mind, the weight of the evening still hung heavily, and she wasn't sure when or how it would fully lift. As the staff began to file out, the restaurant fell into a quiet stillness. The flickering lights overhead seemed to hum with an energy of their own, as though the building itself was breathing a sigh of relief. And in that moment, the manager realized that no matter how much they tried to control the experience, no matter how much they tried to create an atmosphere of perfection, there would always be something beyond their reach, something that could shatter the illusion at any given moment. All they could do was rebuild, slowly, piece by piece, and hope that tomorrow's diners would find the same peace in the restaurant that Karen had stolen from them all tonight.